So welcome everyone. My name is Michele Acuto. I'm director of the Melbourne Centre for Cities, and this is a session at the World Data Forum of the United Nations, and we're going to look into questions that pertain to monitoring sustainable development, urban observatories, and the importance of data in doing so at the local level. What you'll hear from us is a mix of sort of views that come both from the production of a report that I'll talk you through in a minute, experts in the field, from academia and from government, and from UN Habitat, our colleagues that have contributed to the work that we've been doing on this front. So very briefly, I'll talk you through what the grounding report for this session is, and then we'll pass on to speakers. You'll be able to find speakers' bios and outlines in the attachment and the links on the video and on the audio. And without any further hesitation, I'll talk you through what have we learned about observatories. So this is a project that has been in the works for now nearly 25 months. It's a collaborative project, so apologies for lack of logos, but it's a collaborative project between University of Melbourne, UN Habitat, University College London, and more importantly, a very comprehensive and large group of urban research institutions, I'll call them like that, without dubbing them necessarily observatories, that work in cities around the world. The result of this is a set of publications and elements that again you'll find linked to this video and audio that pertains to a comparative review that we've recently published with UCL and UN Habitat on what are urban observatories, and you'll see we've gone well beyond, in a sense, that title of the observatory, but also a sort of more rapid inquiry into how these urban institutions that deal with knowledge and research have tackled the COVID-19 crisis and how they've done their job fundamentally and their practices within the context of the COVID-19 crisis. And you'll be able to find all of that also in a sort of pretty compact and hopefully easily listenable podcast format from the Connected Cities podcast, including this discussion. Now, what have we learned? We've, as I was saying, engaged with quite a wide number of institutions that you see on the map there. So we really try to tackle, as UN Habitat has done actually for quite some time, a broad breadth of, for lack of better terms, urban knowledge institutions from around the world. And these varies pretty substantially from independent think tank type entities like the Centre for Cities in London to mixed hybrid institutions of academia and public sector and other knowledge providers like the GCRO in Johannesburg, to more straightforward academic realities like LSE cities and more. So what we've tried to do is try to understand what they do, what is their value, what is the value of observing the urban in a sense, what is the value of being an urban knowledge institution, and trying to understand how they function. So it's a very open-ended conversation, and it's a conversation about what can we do by institutionalizing the production of knowledge about and for and in cities. So quite a couple of few key points that we've learned by investigating those institutions. We've learned that the scale at which they operate is particularly varied, that it goes from anything from neighborhood and community focuses to really international realities that span multiple countries, multiple urban realities, and multiple different contexts from around the world. But that fundamentally, at least in the snapshot that we took, the international and the national are the predominant scales of observation and of research and of analysis of the urban. And equally, the thematic content of the things that these observatories do really varies massively, from questions of environmental issues, planning and infrastructural matters, governance, mobility, development, economy, global agendas. Interestingly, health, perhaps a little less represented. And I should say this is a piece of work that, if anything, took shape at the beginning of the crisis itself. So I suspect more health now. But the key point there being that the thematic content of what is being observed and studied and analyzed in cities by these institutions is particularly broad. And in fact, the vast majority, not the near totality of these institutions, address multiple themes all at the same time. We looked into the structures and the functionality of this. We're quite interested not just on what kind of knowledge, but how that knowledge is connected, mobilized, produced, gathered. So the institutions themselves, and not surprisingly perhaps, but around the world in our sample, university-hosted realities were still the majority, but just above half of our institutions. So there's still quite a variety of different things, perhaps with less co-hosting. In fact, just one example in our sample of joint university government co-hosting, but still an important predominance of realities that are either independent or provided by government. Now, what they do is an interesting thing, looking at visions and purposes, in the sense that a large majority, nearly 50% of them, explicitly talk about mobilizing knowledge, explicitly talk about collecting and producing knowledge. But also, interestingly, that a good number of them, a third of them, really explicitly try to network knowledge. So not just by becoming repositories of knowledge, but rather mediators of different knowledges and different ways of seeing the cities. And then a number of them explicitly see themselves as a platform for dialogue. So not just about producing data and using data, but in fact, encouraging conversations about cities. So a couple of things that we've learned in both reports. So specifically on their role in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, we've seen many of these places explicitly seeking new approaches to gathering data, to understanding the situation on the ground, and that the crisis itself challenged existing methods and data sources. And it did so in very practical ways, not accessing field sites and voices and data repositories, but also in pushing for innovation, new ways of dealing with data. I'm not going to go through all the findings. Some of the interesting things were about the complexity of dealing with urban complexity and the strengthening that many observatories and many knowledge institutions that deal with urban knowledge found themselves in a societal role, in their capacity to communicate to societies. And not least that the crisis itself, being perhaps one of the most data-intensive crises that we've seen and visited in the last few decades, really strengthened the value proposition for urban knowledge institutions. More generally, what we learned from the overall study is the importance of not just simply tagging observatories, but speaking of observatory-like functions that many institutions play and have even without calling themselves observatories. The importance of the relationships of trust that data and data circulation and data gathering and knowledge more broadly creates, so the trust that these institutions have to rely on in their complex positioning in urban governance, but also that they can foster and create. Equally, the importance that these institutions have in providing continuous information, providing a way to cover gaps in knowledge, and continuing beyond political cycles across disruptions of crisis and more, and the complexity that they have in convening intricate urban realities like cities and speaking to the public, to government, to academia at the same time, with a long-standing question about whether they need a critical distance and a long-standing reality that one of their key functions, if not their key function, is that of networking urban knowledge and knowledges more generally, without presuming that one type of urban knowledge or data itself is the fundamental. To give you a very quick example in a minute from home, in Melbourne itself, we're sort of quite blessed with a very data-rich environment where the city itself provides extensive amount of information, and there's many data providers and data institutions and knowledge institutions more generally around the city. But the most important part, and we have a case study in the report about Melbourne as well, is the variety of forms that this conversation takes place and the dialogue between different knowledge institutions. So we really don't want to sort of put the 32 cases that we looked at on the spot as the only ones, but rather point at the importance of recognizing the role of knowledge institutions that deal in urban information, data, knowledge. And something that we've learned is the importance of the public debate about that data, not just the policy or private sector usage, and the importance that these institutions have in bridging the average 5-kilometer gap between universities and local governments, between town and gown, and their capacity to leverage existing capacity and network urban knowledge. So I encourage you to go and play and look through the findings of that report. I encourage you to see more into that, but again, I strongly recommend everyone in thinking this as fundamentally just the start of a conversation and the start of a open-ended conversation, in a sense, about the role of knowledge institutions and urban knowledge institutions. Now, I'll stop right there. And I'll pass it on to my colleague, Dr. Carla Washburn from University College London at the Urban Innovation and Policy Lab, where she's associate professor and one of the sort of key drivers of the study and the report. So Carla, on to you for your reflections.
Thanks, Michele. Yeah, and I will pick up on a few points. I think that you able to hear me okay? No. Okay, I'll pick up on a few points that Michele's already touched on. And yeah, I'm based at University College London. I really do hope I am unmuted.
I can hear you, but hold on.
You can hear me? Okay, excellent. Apologies. Maybe there may be a delay because of my connection. So I'll try to be slow and clear. I hope I'm coming through. So yeah, as I say, I'll pick up on a few points that Michele's already touched on. I am based at University College London, have been involved in the reports, and I'm one of the many voices that you hear on the podcast if you listen into that. So reflecting particularly on this session, monitoring and reporting for sustainable and inclusive future, urban observatories and capacity building, I thought there were a few things that it would just be useful to reinforce from the work that Michele has already mentioned. So the big report, Urban Observatories, a comparative review, does have some classic elements there, as has been alluded to in assessing the capacities of an institution, elements in terms of where they are, geographical and spatial elements, the different sorts of institutional models, what they do and the outputs. But with this review as well, I think it's important to say, and again, to reinforce that we were trying to offer a more kind of intimate snapshot, I think we call it, within the review itself, and to really understand the different kinds of knowledge that exist and how they're being mobilized. I think speaking to that sustainable and inclusive element in particular, recognizing that the work sought to unpack and unpick capacities that were slightly more nuanced and slightly more difficult to talk about sometimes, I suppose, in these institutional structures. So we did also look at things like visions and motivations, more deeply at the networks and relationships, including who they were. Are they in the private or public sector? Were they with communities directly? And elements around the lived experience of knowledge producers and users. So really trying to knit these pieces together as well. Considering the capacity building element of this panel in particular, there are of course some key challenges remaining for observatories and institutions carrying out observatory-like functions. Working across a range of scales that is a very key one, and some of this speaks to that broader narrative around localizing the SDGs, so remaining locally relevant and understanding and clearly articulating local themes whilst being able to speak at different scales beyond that too, and the integration and synthesis and recognizing the potential and possibility for drawing on different kinds of knowledge is challenging. It's a part of what observatories are setting out to do, but it's something which isn't easy in integrating those different kinds of knowledge in a way that is consistent and meaningful. So the ongoing work, I suppose, and maybe this is a spoiler and we can speak about this more at the end, I think really ties into some of these, understanding some of these elements a little bit more. particularly how observatories go about setting an intention, seeing a gap, understanding exactly what they want to do and what their orientation towards that would be. The ways in which these institutions evolve from the intention that's perhaps been set at the beginning of their establishment. Many of the institutions that we've worked with have been around for a very long time. So how these institutions evolve and respond to internal and external influences. Managing power and influence more broadly, what kinds of audiences observatories are working with and for. And as Michele's already alluded to, and very core within the conversations we had around COVID, development of new methods and understanding how different kinds of methodologies and engagements are especially relevant in the sort of steady state times, if we can call anything that, at present versus responsive mode in times of crisis, as we've seen or as we're seeing over the COVID pandemic. So I think I'll leave it there with my reflections. Shall I hand back very briefly to you, Michele, and then to hand on to our speakers? Thank you.
Super, brilliant. Thanks, Carla, and thanks for that reflection. And yes, we'll jump a bit in between. I'll jump straight off to Sue, if that's okay. So Professor Susan Purnell, Chair of Human Geography at the University of Bristol and Emeritus Professor at the African Centre for Cities in Cape Town, certainly one of the inspirations for us in getting into this work. So could we ask you for a reflection on where do you see this going?
Thanks, Michele and Carla. I think what's already been said very clearly is, and what the report does very well, is that it highlights this very critical interface between urban observatories, local imperatives, and SDG/2030 reporting. And I think what we're left with is a sense that the case has been made that observatories are now part of the toolkit of urban management pretty much everywhere across the world, and even lots of gaps, but there's significant spread. But I thought it'd be worth just picking up on this question about kind of how do we see observatories evolving over the next decade, if you like, of a post-pandemic urbanism. And I've got 5, maybe 6 short points that are, or reflections for us. And the first one, I think, is really about what observatories are not. And I think it's important to recognize that observatories aren't exactly the same thing as the databases that planners have used for over a century to make informed decisions about development, control, and investment, okay? Observatories augment that, but in a way they go beyond that because they offer this interoperable information platform, and they're the brain, if you like, that enable us to assess or to navigate the kinds of complex dynamics that run in cities or through cities or from cities. And so we need to be quite careful that when we seek to strengthen observatories, which have both got an internal and an external orientation, that we don't forego boosting traditional planning capacities. Okay? In other words, if you go back to that 2009 UN Habitat report, making the case for planning, that still exists. Observatories, if you like, are the icing on the cake in the cake, as much as that straight planning capacity development. So that's the first thing. The second thing really relates to the sort of the value of the observatory, which lies in its flexibility. And, you know, in other words, observatories, as we read in the report, have got longitudinal data. They aren't sectorally or professionally specific. They have data formed of different methods. They have interoperable stats and GIS. And those are fantastic strengths to the way that observatories are evolving, but it's also a weakness. And we need to be alert to that as we seek to expand the role of observatories, because they're a little bit like archives or the old libraries. Everybody wants one, and everybody wants a good one, but they don't want to have to invest in it and run it. And so it's really important to ensure that our observatories are institutionally embedded and funded, and that the capacity to maintain them is absolutely put in place. Otherwise, they're going to have very little value for post-pandemic analysis, okay? So that's my second point. And I suppose, in a way, it's a related point, which is really about the scalability. And these flexible institutions of observatories are great. And what we see from the report is that there is no specific scale, although most observatories are place focused. In other words, they have an emphasis on a particular city, defined in different kinds of ways, or city region quite often. But what's really good about them is that the storage and analysis of data can be either expanded or intensified. In other words, you can go to the region or the trans-regional kind of dynamics as much as you can go down to the neighborhood. And I think that's something that we really want to begin to encourage in a post-pandemic environment, because disease, just like pollution, or I suppose even capital investment, does not respect boundaries. Okay, and so that's the paradox for post-pandemic observatories. They've got to be local because they've got to be owned, protected, developed, but they've also got to fit into a wider system. And so it seems to me that this kind of nesting of observatories, in the same way as we talk about nesting the SDGs, localizing them, implementing them in particular places, scaling up from the local through the city region, the national, through to the bigger continental often region, and the global, is really crucial. And the role of UN Habitat in its global observatory really seems to me to be crucial in enabling and facilitating that. Related to that, though, is not just a question of scale, and I don't think we should confuse the issue of scale with the imperative that we try, as we evolve the observatories from what's set out in the report, where you've got these basically major hubs of innovation happening all over the world. But I think to be really useful, observatories have to also be able to speak to global problems. And that means that you need both the capacity for comparison and aggregation. In other words, we need local information that's credible and useful for implementation, but we also need to be able to say, is very different in India from it is in Indonesia. And we need to be able to say, when you scale up the Asian experience of this or the global experience of cities on this, so that aggregate composite picture, and we get some of that from observatories and that capacity from observatories. And there's no reason not to expect much more of our observatories in that regard. It requires careful thinking, careful bedding down of systems, careful reflection of the data systems, or of the issues that we're wanting to track. Something we've talked a lot about in a project I'm involved with called Peak Urban. What do we want to know? Why do we want to know that? What scale do we need to know that on? When is it important that we aggregate? So, and related to that is not just to aggregation, is this issue of trend. So I was very struck, Michele, in the report and looking at the different observatories. And when we think about the next pandemic or the next variant in the pandemic, lots of observatories are focused on the idea of understanding the present or understanding the future. And actually, we also need to be able to backcast. In other words, we need to be able to think historically if we are going to be able to think longitudinally. And it does seem to me that that's a really important area where we can improve and augment the way that observatories are configured and imagined in their response to a post-pandemic urban world. And then I suppose my final point, and probably has a lot more to say about this than I do, is this idea that we need communities of practice to begin to evolve. And what I mean by this is not just that we need institutions like the Global Urban Observatory, but rather that we need the people who are engaged in observatories to have an opportunity to come together, a bit like municipal engineers do or municipal finance people do. In other words, we need a place where people can convene a set of platforms where there is an evolution of expertise, a sharing of knowledge, a professionalization possibly that is critical and reflective, but also innovative and catalytic of a kind of a new generation. Because I think it's out of that context that we begin to be able to see the capacity of urban observatories, not just to inform the local, not just to be driven by new kind of data science, but really to begin to respond to those big issues that face us, not least of which is the pandemic, but also climate change, the economy, various other things as well. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sue. And to the points as usual. So much appreciated. I scribbled quite a few things. So actually, there's a couple of questions already I'll pass on to you. But I think that's an apt point, the question of platform and convening, to then pass on to Robert at Unhabitat. So Robert Dua, who's has been for now quite some time chief of the data and analytics sections of Unhabitat, and I guess sort of additionally, and perhaps more importantly for the conversation here, our steward at Unhabitat for this initiative. I think it'll be a good chance to then move to Samir and the national experience to go through the Unhabitat experience, not just with the observatories, but on the question of monitoring and city level analysis. So Robert, can I pass it on to you for a Unhabitat perspective?
Okay, thanks a lot. And I think building on the previous speakers, it becomes a bit easier for me to connect to all this work. But I thought it would be excellent for us to connect very well to the background and rationale. And from the Unhabitat perspective, we do recognize that cities and all these human settlements are very complex systems. And I think when it came to the COVID-19 pandemic, this was very evident in terms of the required levels of responses, the timeliness, but also the reach to ensure that we leave no one behind. And what we've seen that is also very well documented now is that in cities where we had already active and live urban observatories, they were able at least to bring in all these data elements in time, but also in a responsive manner, at least to respond to the entire crisis. And I think that's where we see the real value of having previous data sets or having systems in place in these complex cities that can allow you to understand how the city is coping or what the real substantive challenges that the city might have. And obviously, where we didn't have active urban observatories, we saw more challenges in terms of understanding who is being left behind, who is more impacted most, and where and how to respond. So most of the local leaders struggled a little bit until those sort of systems were built up. And our rationale for urban observatories here, I think I just want to note the two last bullets here for the objectives, not necessarily the aspect of supporting the local systems, but actually building the local capacities, which is very crucial. And the local capacities here really entails having at least a stronger system at the local urban observatory, and more so one that cascades to the national urban observatory. But the last one that we really promote so much in the urban observatory is the element of ownership, basically ensuring that data is collected, routinely made available for the local support systems, and ensuring that it informs that local first before it comes up all the way to our global urban observatory level. And again, here linking to the crisis that we've been through, that sort of ownership means that if you have a well capacity built or empowered team through the urban observatory, they are able on their own to manage that data sets in a way that digs out the levels of disaggregation, neighborhood analysis, and at the same time visualize it in a way that allows local ownership, but also trust from the local leaders to use that sort of data sets. And our experience in this whole architecture of urban observatory has been that, as many of you I think have spoken as well, that you can't just be an island of data working on your own. You actually need to work very closely with stakeholders. And that's what we've seen, that where we have stronger networks of partners, managers, data producers in cities, we had a bit of an easier feed and response to data collection, but also the packaging and utilization of that data. The other one that we've also seen strongly is that it's also been sort of an awakening call in the process, that for some cities, they've woken up to understand the value of data in terms of decision-making processes. particularly in the elements of ensuring we engage communities, but also we use the same urban observatories to get feedback from the communities to understand how well cities are responding and cascading and flowing that information back and forth from communities to decision makers, which has become very, very key in terms of taking forward. In terms of the way forward that we see, I think we've learned a bit of a lesson that we need to strengthen much of our technical guidance. We had a lot of calls and requests for capacity building during the last 2 years, simply because some urban observatories didn't really have our latest levels of guidance. But we've seen a lot of sharing of experiences, especially the best practices. And I think a better way to document many of those in the last 2 years will be very helpful to carry that forward. And obviously, the facilitation of more partnerships and stronger agreements is an area that we think needs to be strengthened. We've also seen a gap in communicating the results and communicating the data, basically packaging the data and information into knowledge or useful products that local leaders can use. I think many urban observatories struggled a little bit with that space. I feel it's an area that we can further reinforce. And obviously, feeding that information into policy, which is more like the long term, is very crucial. We've always had the certification process for the urban observatories, and we think this needs to be enhanced, particularly around the elements of pandemics and health crises, but also all the other ongoing challenges. I think this needs to be integrated in the criteria for a city to be certified as an active urban observatory. On the larger front, I think we've spoken quite well about the 2030 agenda. But what we've seen as very valuable from our urban observatories is the fact that when you collect data at the city level, you're actually looking not on the urban dimensions alone, but you're looking at a variety of other dimensions within the SDGs, but also other global agendas. And I think here a key plus has been that our urban observatories, because they cover a larger set of data, which crosses into many other SDG goals, we are able to piece together a story of a city, either through production of city profiles or city prosperity index, in a way that can allow us to dig deeper into those problems. And in fact, recently we've been involved in harmonizing our urban monitoring frameworks, and the new global harmonized urban monitoring framework now will go out to our urban observatories, which basically reframes all this context to pull in all these experiences and lessons we've seen from COVID, particularly on the subject matter specific frameworks, which also were handy during that sort of crisis. But here, what is crucial is the combination of other SDGs, the SDG 11 elements, but also the new urban agenda components, and piecing all together into what we would call like city objectives. And here we've strengthened very much the sector-specific monitoring, so that it can allow us to dig out policy implications in a much more easier way. The way, of course, to reflect into that is to see it as this sort of wheel, where when you look at the domains that we are now focusing on around the urban environment, the society, economy, culture, and governance, you're able actually to dig out city objectives in each of those. And this is the sort of tool that has benefited as part of our consultation from urban observatories to help us retailer some of the key indicators they think are good to carry forward. And it's something that we look forward to working with all of you and many other partners as we push through the urban observatory agenda. I'll leave it at that, and back to you, Michael.
Great, thanks a lot, Robert, for that. I think it's an apt jumping point to pass on to Samira before we get to maybe trying to tackle a couple of questions that we've got. So without much hesitation, and with all of our thanks for doing this a bit short, short-lived and short term, I'll pass it on to Samira Odai, who's Center Director in the National Statistics Institute, or Institut National de la Statistique in Tunisia, and see if we can take a broader national perspective onto this conversation. Samira, all yours.
Yes. Thank you, Michel. Do you hear me?
Perfectly.
Okay, thank you. So now I will speak about our experience in INS, about urban monitoring and reporting. As introduction, I will speak about the information, the data who is produced in INS, who is the most important source of production of urban area in Tunisia. This data comes essentially from censuses and social and economic surveys. There is other governmental institutions who use this data to conduct their work. For example, the Housing Ministry is using our data to establish the urban plans according to our data produced. And at the same time, we find also that most cities in Tunisia have lacked urban level monitoring system, and they rely on INS for the monitoring of their development. But the problem now that is the most finest data which is coming from the censuses is not available for a long time because the census, we conduct the census each 10 years, and data isn't available for a long time, and this gap of data doesn't help us to have a continuous monitoring of cities and urban areas. This is why we concluded that it is necessary to have our own observatory in Tunisia and ENS, of course. And in this sense, a project has been initiated with city authorities and other partners. And it was with the assistance of UN Habitat. This project is conducted in order to initiate an observatory at the level of the two cities, which are Monastir and Tozeur. As you can see here, in this map, you can see Tozeur at the south of Tunisia, and Monastir at the east of Tunisia. What we have done in terms of urban monitoring at the point, it was the installation of the core of an urban observatory at ENS. The purpose is for monitoring SDGs and urban indicators, and at the level of the two pilot cities, and they are used to support decision making and the formulation of evidence-informed policies. So the approach that was initialized with the help of the Habitat Data and Analytics Unit is based on the use of the City Prosperity Initiative, which permitted us to measure the prosperity of the two cities. For that purpose, we developed, collected, and analyzed disaggregated data on social, civic, cultural, economic, political performance of the two cities, and more than 50 indicators have been established and calculated. The data used is coming from different kinds of sources. We used formal sources like census data, administrative and survey data, and other sources are used also from informal sources like Earth observations, especially used for the delimitation of the city's boundaries, and for the urban localized indicators like the city growth and the population access to public transport, and the access of the population to open spaces also. During this project, UN Habitat initiated the technicians of the INS to collect and manage data to compute urban indicator. The objective of the capacity building was to enhance the use of urban indicators in INS from collection to reporting through urban indicators production, and to produce science-based reports for the dissemination of the urban indicators results, and to help the decision-making and the formulation of urban policies and planification. Specialized training were conducted also on data collection and analysis, and the new methods on spatial indicators special indicators to monitor progress made in the implementation of the SDG 11. The people who have been trained came from different institutions and were from different disciplines. Beneficiaries were technical managers of the cities of Monastir and Tozeur, city society, universities, institutions in charge of housing, waste management, public transport, cultural heritage, and disaster risk reduction. What we gain from this project is the development of competences on new spatial analysis methods and disaggregation techniques. Also, new experiences focused on data collection and analysis using methods and Earth observation data were developed. Also, experiences on production and reporting on new data across urban prosperity indicators were developed in INS, and enhanced cooperation with several actors and institutions worked in synergy to promote sustainable development in the two cities were engaged in this project. Also, INS has provided also information and data in order to add the urban responsibility and sanitary decision making for the COVID-19 crisis during last year. As you can see in this slide, a multi-dimensional risk assessment tool was provided in order to identify priority areas of fragility and prioritize resources for prevention, preparedness, capacity development, and management for the medium and long-term COVID risk monitoring and assessment. The vulnerability map presented here attempts to quantify and classify in terms of fragility the different regions of the country at the finest level of geographic division, to inform also strategy for target deconfinement and the gradual normalization of the city's activities, and at the end to anticipate a possible return to the spread of COVID-19 and its impact on the population. In fact, to better understand the vulnerability map and its particularities, it is useful to compare the map illustrating the different dimensions. As you can see here in this slide, the vulnerability map is based on 3 dimensions. The first one is the exposure to risk. The second is the vulnerability. And the third one, the capacities to cope with pandemic response. The data used to compute these indicators are provided from social surveys, administrative sources, and Earth observation data at the finest geographic level. We used also the data from census. And as conclusion, I think that nowadays in INS, we think that the data collect both at part of UN Habitat project and the COVID vulnerability work. And the good work done in this sense imposes us in some way to finalize the urban observatory installation to support the continuous urban monitoring and promote enhanced use of data for decision. And thank you for your attention.
Brilliant. Thanks, Samir. Thanks for taking the time, and thanks for taking us with feet on the ground, which I think helps a lot in this conversation. I'll stop talking immediately because we've got quite a few questions. So just a quick selection of questions. I think it's there are some interesting prompts in there. And I'll just ask everyone to pick one of those 3 questions and stick to 2 minutes so we can stick to allocated time here. But there's lots that we could possibly unpack in this conversation. So the 3 questions that I thought were particularly interesting from our online attendees are a question on whether COVID has in fact interrupted the evolution of observatories. So has COVID interrupted that process of evolution? A question about has the impact and response to COVID meant a loss of data ownership? I guess sort of picking up on what Robert was talking about, with public and academic institutions heavily impacted. So a loss of data ownership towards the private sector. And the third question is the emphasis on data sets in the global pandemic reporting, running the risk of encouraging unfair comparisons when really many urban issues are highly contextual. So as per the question, are we making, is the COVID emphasis on data making us compare apples and pears? I'm sure that you could all speak for hours on this, but I'll ask you to pick one, starting with Carla and then going to Sue and then Robert and Samira. Carla, which one would you like to pick?
So I will pick question one. I'll go chronologically, I guess. So in terms of the interruption in the evolution of observatories by COVID, I suppose the quick answer is absolutely yes. In a way, there are, of course, negative elements to this. So I don't want to paint COVID as a positive opportunity only. I think there have been many ways in which the kind of desired or intended evolutionary trajectories of observatories has been interrupted by COVID because of the necessary change in mode that's meant that things have been more responsive, or there has been a focus on different kinds of issues than perhaps those observatories had been building kind of networks or trajectories or competencies in. But I think in the work that we've done and the initial research that we've done, at least with observatories, understanding the ways in which they have been able to respond or support responses, it has also opened an interesting space of opportunity to understand what observatories perhaps didn't see they could be doing, and now have that remit or have that go ahead or have the capacity to experiment or have additional resources to be able to kind of investigate new evolutionary routes that perhaps weren't planned. So yes, some negative, some positive. And I think actually this will be a big part of our ongoing conversation.
Brilliant. Perfect to time as well. Sue, which one would you like to pick?
I'll go for number two. I mean, it's a really interesting question. I'm not entirely sure that it's too early to judge whether there's been a loss. I think what the pandemic has highlighted is that there are a lot of data sets we have not used, could use, that might be incorporated, some of which are public and some of which are private. And that's the first thing. The second thing is that I think what's really important is that my anxiety about the loss of data because of the pandemic is that the pandemic is likely to focus on biomedical interventions and responses and not on institutional responses. And the real loss, I think, will come because of the failure to understand non-biomedical research that impacts on understanding and responding to pandemics and to other major urban issues. And so it seems to me that that's a really, really important area to be looking at. The money that's spent, the capacity that's developed, and the systems that are put in place. Vaccines are terrific. I am an absolute advocate for vaccines, but it's got to be vaccines plus, or we're not going to go anywhere.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Sue. Robert, which one do you feel like picking?
Thanks, Michele. I will take number 3 and give it a try here. So I think essentially the issue here about our urban areas being quite, complex systems, but at the same time, we also recognize that many of our urban areas are actually contextual. So there's a very thin balance there of looking at the complexity, but also the contextual aspect. At the global level, we've been pushing very much for standards that allow you to basically work with a uniform set of indicators, cascading these through our urban observatories to ensure that data is collected using one standard, analyzed using one system or a comparable standard. Then you will avoid that element of unfair comparison when it comes in. But what we know, and especially during this global pandemic, it's basically most local governments, most local leaders who are being measured in terms of performance using almost a uniform standard. Are your COVID rates going down? Are you responding better? And so therefore, a very crucial sort of platform to work with standard data sets and the standard way of analyzing all this. So what we've seen here is that data sets and data in general was actually a key driver to help understand the trends in the pandemic, but at the same time, how well local governments were responding. And I think with a few of those standard indicators, we're able to see who was performing well and who wasn't performing well. And I think going forward, it's very crucial for us to keep setting those standards through our urban observatories so that we avoid comparing apples and pears, but rather compare like for like. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Robert. And last but not least, Samira, do you feel like picking any one of those three questions? And you're on mute.
Sorry, just I want to speak about the importance of observatory, especially in Tunisia and ENS too, because our government, for example, didn't install an observatory yet, and all the urban data produced in INS wasn't enough to a continuous monitoring and for example, for the vulnerability map we have last year, we found much problems because the data, there is lots of gap data, and also the data that was available, it wasn't up to date, and I think that it is important to have an observatory installed in Tunisia for the continuous monitoring of urban data, and why not for other monitoring studies. Voilà. Thank you. I think that you
Merci. Thanks a lot, Samira. Right on the dot, everyone. I really appreciate you playing with this format. I'm sure that and thanks to the 71 folks online for listening to our ramblings on observatories. I think it gives us sort of a lot of prompts for the next on this, but spot on the 9:30 burn time. I would like to extend all my sincere thanks to Carla, to Susan, to Robert and Samira. We did this across France, the UK, Kenya, and Tunisia and Australia, which is always quite a feat these days. They're grateful for your input and stay tuned on that. And as Carla pointed out, yes, we've got a name for a podcast, but you're going to have to wait for the podcast to hear what the name is. Thanks, everyone, and thanks for tuning in.